Okay, this is lecture 2 of Armitage and Braddick's book. We're going to be talking about chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is Alison Jones' Migration. Chapter 3 is Economy by Nuala Zahedieh. And the first lecture, the first layout is of the theoretical components of it. Now we begin to see how this is playing out in actual discussion. So we're going to talk about migration, and we're going to talk about economy. So James's argument is that there's, and it's useful here to know that there's something in migration studies that is a function known as chain migration. And chain migration is a theoretical construct that says the following. When somebody goes out and moves into a new area, they send back information about this area. And then their family members or townspeople or co-religionists begin to follow them like links on a chain. So the migration is following in the path of the first one who goes, and it becomes richer and stronger as more and more people moving along like links on a chain. So chain migration is a concept in migration study that James is drawing upon, and then she uses that to also talk about what we will see is the primary type of migration in this Atlantic world system, which is migration in chains as opposed to chain migration. Chain migration carries with it the idea of some measure, it's your choice to do so. Migration in chains says you're dragged there and sold there. And as we shall see, as we've seen previously with Klein, that the Atlantic slave trade is a major system of migration of people in chains, but it also includes indentured servants, people who sign up for temporary slavery, and convicts, people who are sentenced to this type of position. They're convicted of crimes and sent. The British Empire changed many of its crimes from some sort of capital punishment or awful punishment to people for committing crimes to what they called transportation. So they shipped people to Georgia, which was a penal colony. They sent them to Australia or other places. That this is a type of sentencing for your crimes. So James is talking about migration, and she's talking about this business, and she wants to make the argument that it's related to population growth. As we've seen with Crosby, the arrival of American food crops leads to a burgeoning population. This burgeoning population, they're running out of places to go to. Some of this is they're being shoved off the land from something known as the Enclosure Movement, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But some of it's just the sheer size of the population expanding. And in this early period, the economic capacity to absorb these extra laborers does not exist. So you have a lot of rootless people who drift into the cities because hopefully they can find opportunities in the cities. So the cities begin to swell, and so you have massive urbanization that goes on. So speaking broadly, James wants to talk about two types of migration. The first is internal migration, which is what we we're just talking about. It's the movement of people from the local rural community first to urban areas. And so you see a stunning growth, rapid growth in the rise of cities in England and then Scotland and then later Ireland. And this is part of it, but also this internal migration, people move much further than just to the local city, as it were. So she provides some figures on page 34 of this stunning growth in urbanization, right, in which the cities grow extremely rapidly, swollen by migrants from the countryside, in effect. Some of these are drawn to the cities. They see better opportunities, or they see little opportunities in where they are, and they hope to make a better chance of it in the city. But a lot of this is people who are forced off the land as the landowners shift from a system in which was largely a little bit more than subsistence farming. Peasants could grow enough to feed themselves, and they had a little bit of surplus that then the landlord could sell. But the landlords determined they could make more money raising export things like wool or other things. So they began to force the peasants off the land, right? And so when they forced these people off the land in what's known as the Enclosure Movement, you had a lot of people who had, what are they going to do? So they drift to the cities in a type of internal migration. This is quite a dramatic change from the way they were living before. So even though it doesn't count as emigration or immigration, depending on where you're standing, it is a type of dramatic movement. It's just internal. This internal movement moves to formally external, and Games argue that this is just the logical and seamless extension of the process. That when people drifted to London or Edinburgh or Liverpool and they found their opportunities stilted, they continued to move, and now the new place to move is the overseas colonies. And so this movement, external movement, is of a population out of a region into another region, generally what we would call formal emigration and immigration. And Games says this movement, this external movement, is largely unfree. 69% in the 16th and 17th century of all people that moved around the Atlantic world were African slaves, by definition, unfree, right? So 69% of the movement of people across the ocean comes in the form of African slaves. Of the remaining 31%, 75% of the Europeans who move across the ocean move either as indentured servants, signing up for temporary slavery, or convicts, sentenced to a type of slavery for an extended period. So by far, most of the people who move in this migration stream are people who are forced or dragged across this system, right? So what this means is that the control of the labor in this Atlantic world is shaped by violence, right? Slaves are terrorized in order to do the work. Temporary slaves in the form of indentured servants are restricted in their movements. They can't leave their indentured to their contract is filled. Convicts can't leave until their sentence is fulfilled. And all of these systems use coerced labor and violence in order to achieve their outcomes, which gives a distinctive shape to these colonial worlds. Far and away, the movement of people in these structures are predominantly males, and especially young males. So it's a violent system in which there's little incentive or opportunity for what we would normally see as family creation, right? So that means that these colonies are excessively violent because they have a lot of young men who are having violence inflicted upon them to work, or are the ones who are inflicting the violence. This is the general pattern for the Atlantic world, with one key exception in this early period, and that key exception is the New England colonies. The New England colonies are unusual. As its name suggests, it's New England, so the colonists there saw it as roughly comparable to England, although there are some important climatic differences. But in terms of what you could grow there, it's pretty much the same as England. So you don't have the opportunity to grow export crops as you do in the southern colonies and in the Caribbean, right? So it doesn't support a system of coerced labor in the form of plantations, because there's really nothing that you can grow to make it profitable to do so. In addition, many of the people who initially colonize the New England colonies are people who are fleeing for some sort of, or drawn to some sort of religious ideal world they're going to create, and so they come as family units. So the migration stream to New England colonies is much more evenly balanced between males and females. And when they establish themselves as colonists in these New England colonists, they produce materials on family farms, and family farms privilege more hands on deck. So they privilege increased birth rates because all the hands you can get to help you survive and expand on your farm comes in the form of family labor. What that also means is that the people who arrive in this system and work in this system, they have, especially since New England had access to quite a large amount of land available to be transformed into family farms, you had great opportunity for people to leave, establish their own families, and establish their own farms. So the New England colonies are unusual partly by the migration stream, who comes, but also because the New England colonies are comparatively healthy. It's not a terrible place to live, especially in these early days. The rivers run deep and fast, so you don't live amongst your waste. As we saw the problems with the Jamestown colony, which is tidal flat, you also don't have those problems of the economy is largely rural driven, so people move out into their own homestead farms that they carve out of the forest, and so they're sort of they're separated. So many of the problems of crowding that you see in other places don't exist, and the water runs fresh and clean in New England. So, and these figures are nicely illustrated, or this relationship, the difference of the New England colonies in this migration pattern is nicely illustrated by some figures from Alan Taylor's book, American Colonies, right? So this is European migration in the 17th century, so from 1600 to 1699. In the New England colonies, 21,000 migrants moved from Europe to New England in the 1600s. And I will tell you that almost all of them came in what's known as the Great Migration, which is in the 1620s. So by after the 1630s, there's very little migration to the New England colonies. Most of the colonists stayed there, and because it was relatively healthy. In fact, in the 17th century, living in the greater Boston area, the average lifespan was 79 years, right? So that's almost comparable to what we have today. So the New England colonies, you had 21,000 migrants, most of them who came in the 1620s. By 1700, that population had increased to 91,000. The Chesapeake colony, so Virginia, the Carolinas, you had 120,000 people emigrate to the Chesapeake colonies. By 1700, you had 85,000. So not only did it not naturally grow, it actually declined. So you had a drop off. You had less population, people living there in 1700 than the people who moved there over the course of the century. In the West Indies, it's even more stark. 190,000 Europeans emigrated to the West Indies. In the 1700 census, there were only 33,000 people who lived in those colonies. This was a murderous regime. So that meant that in the West Indian colonies in particular, but also the Chesapeake colonies, you needed a constant input of labor. New people constantly had to move in because the mortality rate was so high, and that's not the case in New England colonies, right? So the New England colonies are an unusual counterexample. The usual pattern of stuff is much different, right? Okay, so economy. Oops, a little too fast on that, sorry. Zahedieh's talking about the economy, and we're going to talk about, and she uses a standard trope, or it's a common way for historians to tell a story. So when you look back through the documents of various sorts of things, people make all sorts of predictions. Some are wildly inaccurate, some never come to pass, but every once in a while you come across one that turns out to be pretty much accurate. That's what she's using here. She's using a letter from a person named Hakluyt, who writes of his scheme to the Queen in 1584. And what he's talking about is, he says, look, the Spanish are getting rich, the Portuguese are getting rich, the French are getting rich. We need to get in on this colony business. But as opposed to the type of colonies that we see in these other places where the Spaniards they're a type of extractive colony. They're taking money out of the ground literally in the form of gold and silver and shipping it back, right? The French are a type of extractive colony. They set up fur traders who were negotiating or bartering for trade with the native peoples in the form of fur, which then they ship back, right? So the French colonial footprint is relatively light, and they're extracting wealth in the form of furs from this colonial outpost. Hakluyt says, I propose that we set up a settler colony in which we move people from the expanding population here in England. We ship them across to our colonies where they then will clear the land and they will grow crops and materials that we can use here in England, in the mother country. a settler colony moving people over with the intent they're going to stay, and they're going to generate products here for us at home, right? He's proposing what becomes known as the system of mercantilism. And mercantilism shares a lot of characteristics that are similar to capitalism, but it's a different system, right? And so what are the similar characteristics? Well, in the mercantile system, the colonists are going to sell things, right? They're going to grow or gather or harvest or do whatever and sell stuff and generate profits that will make it attractive for them to do so. But unlike capitalism, which says when you produce a product, you sell it to the highest bidder, maximizing your return, the mercantile system says this is a system designed to benefit the mother country, as it's referred to. The colonies have a subservient role to serve the mother country. Their job is to produce materials that we can use here. They're also serving as a market for the things we make here, which we preferentially sell to them. So it's not selling to the highest bidder. You're selling it and getting cash for it, but you're selling it only to representatives of the mother country. The idea is the colonies serve the mother country, enriching the mother country while keeping a little bit of the enrichment for themselves. Part of this is because the English colonies can't, and this is the system that develops. This mercantile system is the system that first develops in this colonial world. Part of this is because the English colonies don't find a way to get quick wealth. They would have loved, or at least the English colonists would have loved, if they could have found gold and silver lying about that they could get rich off of, right? And as much as they looked for it, they couldn't find any in the places they went to. So there is some of this extractive colony business. They don't find any gold to dig out like the Spaniards are doing. So they don't have access to the same fur that the French do, although there is some fur trade, to be sure. And they also have some extractive colony business in the form of fishing. There's rich fishing grounds that are found off the coasts, right? These are extractive industries, but by and large, the way these colonies are going to be successful is if they clear, cultivate, and produce goods. So this is a settler system in which people are coming to stay. And the simplest example or counterexample is when we talked about the Spanish second voyage to the New World, where Columbus brought 5,000 colonists who were coming with seedlings and animals and all the things necessary to begin to produce stuff for sale and delivery back to the mother country. But the one thing they didn't bring in were any women. So there's not a clear sign that they're not planning on staying. They're not bringing their wives and they're not bringing children, right? The idea is I'm coming over, I'm going to get rich, and then I'm going to go back to Spain. That's an extractive colony mindset. This is a settler colony where the people are planning on coming and staying, or so is seen as the design. And these initial colonies come in the form of private operations, private stock operations by people hoping to get rich out of what they're going to produce or find in the New World. Many of these early investors, not by accident, come from their colonial experience of Ireland, in which they have made profits from forcing the Irish off the land, Irish Catholics off the land, and then planting their own fellow religionists or Scottish Protestants on this landscape, and then inducing them to pay them rent for the stuff they bring. So these colonies begin at first as private gambles, but as they go bankrupt, the crown steps in and takes them over. So initially they're independent operations, but they become crown properties later. And when they're under the control of the crown is imposing state control over this trading system. They formalize this idea of mercantilism in a series of legislation, parliamentary acts known as the Navigation Acts, which are passed in 1651, 1660, and 1663. The Navigation Acts are about controlling the economic production of the colonies and the relationship of the colonies and the mother country. These acts do contain some revenue generating components. It's partly about making money for the crown, but it's mostly about directing trade. And what undergirds this structure is the British attempt to copy what the Dutch are doing. The Dutch had captured what's known as the carrying trade. They had built a lot of ships who carried stuff around the Atlantic world. They also sailed around the Horn of Africa and were muscling in on the Indian Ocean world that the Portuguese had carved out. So the Dutch were capturing the carrying trade, in which they were buying goods from these new lands and bringing them back to Holland, where they were either further refined or they were sold in markets across Europe by Dutch merchants. So this system had produced great wealth for the Dutch Empire. The British liked this idea, but wanted to keep their colonial production for themselves. So they put in legislation designed to do that. And there's a number of moving pieces in these navigation acts, but there's three primary tenets that have to be adhered to. Number one, only English ships can trade with English colonies. And they provided a very exact definition of what an English ship is. An English ship is one that's captained by an English captain and or has a crew that is 3/4 or more English sailors, and the ship had been manufactured in English shipyards, right? This is an attempt to build English ship and English naval trade up by directing that the colonies can only trade using English vessels, right? There is a caveat to this, or a component of this. Under this definition of the Navigation Acts, English ships include ships that are built in London, Liverpool, Bristol, wherever, right? But it also includes ships built in Boston or Newport or Baltimore or Barbados, for that matter, if they were to build ships there, right? So the colonial world fits under the definition of English shipping, right? At the time, this is seen as a way because these colonies have access to tremendous quantities of wood, and so they can build viable ships for the crown, right? It later becomes a problem, but it's not one they initially anticipated. So that's one of the major tenets. Two, certain enumerated commodities must go to the mother country. And as you can readily think, it's the ones that are most valuable. So tobacco, sugar, other high dollar items by law must be traded directly to the mother country, right? This is expressly designed to undercut their competitors, particularly the Dutch. So a sugar plantation producing sugar that needs to go and be further refined for the market. In a capitalist system, they would sell it to whoever the highest bidder was. So if there were an English bidder or a Dutch bidder or a Spanish bidder, it would make a difference. Whoever you could capture the most money from, that's what the market would determine, right? But that's not the system that operates here. Under these Navigation Acts, you must sell it to English captains who will deliver it to England. That's how the system has to work, right? Because this is by law as part of the Navigation Act. Third, European goods have to pass through English ports prior to shipping. Now, this one is partly about generating revenue directly, right? So when European goods have to pass through English ports before they're shipped to the colonies, they have to pay a tax. So this is partly about generating money for the crown by taxing these other goods. But it's mainly about making these other goods more expensive so that you would purchase English manufactured goods directly. This was designed to build up the English production of finished goods by guaranteeing a market where your goods would be cheaper than your competitors from other European states, right? So it's mainly about directing the trade to benefit English manufacturing, but there also get a little bit of the money on it. Now, the system isn't perfect for the English. There's always a lot of cheating and smuggling that goes on, but by and large, it's very effective. This produces more money for the empire, for the crown, and that money is turned around and producing a much more powerful English navy. So the revenues generated, the ships that are being constructed and used, these are all things that benefit the crown in the form of having a better and bigger navy. It also serves to limit outflow of these valuable commodities to your competitors, especially the Dutch. So it's undercutting the Dutch ability to carry stuff and make profits on it, to serve as merchants, capturing the wealth for themselves, and they don't like it. So there's a series of Anglo-Dutch wars that are fueled by this attempt by the English to control their colonial system, right? And so we can talk a little bit about some of these successful products. The first successful product in this system is tobacco. In 1616, John Rolfe crosses a strain that was standard in the British Empire, is grown in the Caribbean, with a strain that the Native Americans smoked in Virginia. By crossing these two strains, he created apparently a more sweet tasting tobacco strain, which was less harsh for people to smoke. And so it captured a large share of the market. I should note that John Rolfe created this in 1616. It was too late for the Virginia colony. The Virginia colony went bankrupt in 1619, and it reverted to the crown. So all the investors lost all their money. They went bankrupt. And then the crown took over Virginia colonies just when it developed a very profitable item. In 1624, by 1624, I should say, 200,000 pounds of tobacco were being shipped out of the Virginia colonies back to the mother country, where they were then sold throughout Europe. By 1638, these 200,000 pounds had grown to more than 3 million pounds of tobacco. This is a tremendous flourishing of this profitable crop, tobacco. And it was highly profitable. In the 1620s, tobacco crops sold for 5 to 10 times what it cost to manufacture or to grow them and process them. This highly remunerative return for the production of it led to increased production, which in some way would be bad because then it drives down the price for what you get for the commodity. But because it became cheaper for people to purchase it, then even poorer folks could purchase tobacco. And as the Surgeon General continually tells us, tobacco is very addictive. So this meant that a larger percentage of the European population became addicted to tobacco grown in these Virginia colonies in the Carolinas, and it became a very profitable business. It also served to fuel population growth in these colonies as more and more people came. Some of them survived their indenturitude and began to grow their own tobacco products, and so it became a magnet for other people to migrate to. The second successful crop is sugar, and it's remarkably successful. And the problem about sugar production is that it has very high startup costs. Sugar production is not worth a damn unless you have a sugar mill in which to produce it, and sugar mills are very expensive. When the British captured their own sugar islands in the form of Barbados and Jamaica, they wanted to copy what other sugar producers were doing. And so in the 1640s, the English began to copy the Portuguese and to begin to start producing sugar on these islands. In 1645, shortly after they began sugar production on these islands, 1,000 slaves were purchased. By 1780, the full working system of plantation sugar operations was occurring on both islands, and it had developed its distinctive shape in the enslaved population. In 1780, on Barbados and Jamaica, you had 489,000 slaves toiling away on these sugar plantations. The white population on these two islands was 48,000. This is a relationship of what is indicative of these sugar islands, in which you have 10 slaves for every white person on these plantations. This meant many different things. One of the things it means is that the white population is justifiably terrified of their much more numerous enslaved population. So in order to maintain control, they use very draconian exhibitions of violence in order to maintain their control. This relationship treated the slaves extremely harshly for any infraction, because the whites are terrified that the black population will raise up against them. Related to this production of sugar is the other end of this equation, the consumption of sugar. And these figures come from a marvelous book by Sidney Mintz called Sweetness and Power. And Mintz charts the use of sugar in Europe, right, which first starts off as a medicinal thing, and then it becomes something that only the wealthy have. and then it becomes something much more as sugar production increases. His argument is that the sugar that becomes a major component of people's daily life is it's not empty calories. The way we talk about sugar now is that they're empty calories. We have so many calories we get from our food sources that we don't need the sugar on top of it. They're just wasted calories, right? Mintz argues that these were not empty calories for this laboring population in the 17th and 18th century, that these were things that kept the poor alive. And so it's a transition where initially the population growth emigrated out or migrated out, or the majority of them moved off the land and swelled the cities and then maybe spilled over into the colonial system because there was such a demand. So this is what leads or contributes to the development of the indentured system, the indentured servant system. The indentured servant system begins to end because factory and industrial production begins to sop up this extra labor. And so the expanding population goes to work in the factories. But this expanding population is very poorly paid. And so they become very reliant upon simple food sources. We saw in that first film, Van Gogh's painting of the potato eaters, which are poor people living in a hovel, working in an urban area and living off of potatoes, right? And potatoes are cheap and they're easy, relatively easy to grow. And so they don't need a lot of tending. So they're the perfect food for the poor. But what Mintz argues is the caloric intake of these people is insufficient for the demands of being placed upon them. And so what develops is a system where instead of taking an hour for lunch and leaving the premises, people were given a short tea break in which they have a short period of time in which they get a hot beverage, like an imported beverage like tea, that's sweetened with sugar, and maybe they get some small sugar cakes. These things, the tea has a stimulant property, sugar has a stimulant property. They're also mildly addictive. So what Mintz argues is that he estimates that in these populations, sugar forms 9 to 12% of the caloric intake. Absent this 9 to 12%, the people would actually have starved based upon what the wages they were getting and the work that was demanded of them. The way that sugar functions inside a person is that when you have caloric demands, the first thing that burns off is sugar. And then after you burn the calories from sugar, then you begin to break down your fats, which are turned into sugar, which are then burned. And then after you use up your store of fat, then you begin to break down muscle mass and protein, right? So this sugar is not an empty calorie. It's actually a buffer that provides enough calories to keep people moving along without consuming their own body from that. And combined with that is this delivery of more and more sugar onto the market is met with increased demand. And so I chose a couple figures. He has a whole list of them. So in 1700, the average consumption per capita in England and Wales of sugar was 4 pounds. Now per capita means per head. So that means men, women, and children. So in 1700, every person in England and Wales consumed 4 pounds of sugar. By 1770, that had increased to 10 pounds of sugar per capita. It should also be noted that the population boomed between 1700 and 1770. So we're not only talking, they're more than doubling the consumption per capita, you're also having a lot more heads to distribute around. So the consumption of sugar has expanded greatly and is expanding the market. By 1970, for comparison, which is where Mintz ends his charting, 1970, the per capita consumption of sugar was 120 pounds per year. So that's an enormous quantity of sugar, which I will tell you, that number is certainly dwarfed by whatever we're consuming today or whatever we're consuming today in England and Wales. Sugar is said to have what's known as high price elasticity. High price elasticity means the following. Something that has a high price, people who want it will purchase it, but they'll only purchase it in small amounts because it has a high price. But when the high price elicits more supply because people make money supplying that market. So more supply comes onto the market. That more supply drives down the cost of the commodity, right? So when there's more sugar available, sugar becomes cheaper, right? So if you normally consumed 4 pounds a year, right? Now you could be buying 4 pounds a year and be a lot cheaper, but sugar has high price elasticity, which means the following. When the product becomes cheaper, people consume more of it. And as they consume more of it, they draw down this excess surplus and the price rises. That price rises, draws more supply, which again drives down the price, supply and demand, right? There's more supply on the market. And as the price declines again, people increase their sugar consumption further. So this cycle continually sops up the extra amount of sugar that's delivered into the market, and the price for that continually bounds up high because when it becomes cheap, people consume more of it. And then now they're consuming at a much higher level. And when it becomes cheap again, they consume even more of it. So this sugar was a remarkably successful crop for the colonial empire by making it by statute, by law, that it could only be shipped to the mother country. They set up a system where this wealth funnels through the mother country. And the mercantile system would have continued nicely benefiting the mother country, the colonies less so, although they still benefit. The wealthiest people, as we shall see in this English world, became absentee sugar plantation owners, but that's a little bit later in our book. But the system designed to benefit the mother country, they're getting the raw materials produced by the colonies. They have a market to sell their goods. They've codified this market. I'll give you an example. On the sugar islands, there has to be some initial processing of sugar, right? So there is a little bit of industrial work, the sugar mill, because if you don't process that cane in the first 24 hours, the sugar cane spoils and it's worthless. So after that first processing, as we saw in the first film, where they're stirring and crystallizing the sugar over high heat, right? It draws off a waste liquor that is molasses and a few other side products. It was illegal to process that molasses in the colonies, in the sugar islands themselves. So molasses became something that was shipped to London, which became one of the largest rum producers in the world because rum is a finished product. It was illegal to produce rum in the sugar islands, although that would make the most sense because that's where the sugar is, right? But it became illegal, and so London became the world's greatest seller of distilled molasses known as rum. That's a finished product set up by law. What undercuts this whole system is the North American colonies, because under the Navigation Acts, they count as English property. So what happens is, increasingly, as the North American colonies begin to expand and produce materials, they're shipping things directly to the sugar islands and the colonies of the Caribbean and the South, and those goods are going back to the North American colonies. They never go through the mother country at all. So the North American colonies, under the definition of the Navigation Acts, part of England, they're benefiting from this colonial system, and it's not benefiting the mother country at all. In fact, they're competing with the mother country. So shipbuilders in London and Liverpool are competing with shipbuilders in Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore. Rum producers in London are competing with rum producers in Boston who are buying this molasses and turning it into finished rum. So London was the largest producer of rum in the world. Boston was number 2. Neither one of those things are located in places where sugar is produced. They're part of this system. What eventually undercuts this system that makes it untenable is this competition within the colonial structure of these North American colonies, which undercut the entire system. Okay, that's what we have for today on these 2 chapters. Keep up with your readings, and I'll start the next one next time.